And we're back. We had some slight technical challenges and stuff, so hopefully we've solved that. We'll kind of keep our fingers crossed to see how things go. So the last thing we kind of talked about was basically this idea of like the minute that you split off a copy, as Dolores did with the Charlotte copy and stuff, it really changes things. It really kind of it's just like many things. It's now you're creating new memories, and that's based on different decisions. So in some ways, it's the fact that like we are making these decisions and constantly doing that the different sets of decisions is in some ways, like kind of just as much as our memories, what defines us.
Yeah, the choices definitely. I mean, there's a lot of choice being a main sort of another big theme of this season, and how that determines different characters. In terms of Dolores copying herself, though, I thought this was a really interesting idea, because that takes me back to reading Age of M by Robin Hanson, because he said that what would happen is in a system where it's trying to determine a particular outcome, and it's basically an AI system, it would just take the most efficient route to achieving its goals. So right. Dolores, being the most efficient at breaking out of her confinement, just realizes that she's the most efficient model to copy. And so that's a very kind of that's very much in keeping with his line of thinking of what would actually happen in that scenario. And also that leads me back to something that Lisa Joy said in one of the sort of little extra bits, where she said, even though she actually thinks that in terms of following a script and following looped behavior, humans are far more predictable and will follow the same behavior because we have a kind of a limited sort of consciousness, and the hosts are more complicated, can evolve more quickly, and have lots of different outcomes that they could pursue. So they will evolve far quicker and make much more unpredictable choices. And so you kind of see that in this Charlotte Hale Dolores difference, in that it's only been a very short period of time, and they're supposed to essentially be the same person, but they're evolving their own sort of mindsets that much more quickly. Right. And of course, we have to remember that Maeve is more or less based on Dolores as well, but she's evolved a completely different sort of philosophy of how she deals with the world. But I think this whole idea of taking one thing, copying it, but they move in a way that you can't necessarily predict, and they move so quickly that they perform, they have similar mindsets among their own copies, which is, as we see at the end, that's basically what Hale is doing. She's making multiple copies of herself. And this again, and this is kind of my season 4 story crafting here, but I think they're going to explore this idea in that they have different clans, so to speak. You will have like the Hale William clan who share similar goals. The Valley of the Beyond, which would be like maybe a Dolores construction, or a Bernard construction, basically. So I think that's what they're going to. I think this whole thing of sort of clan identity and mindset creating societies will be a theme for the next season.
Yeah, and that brings an interesting kind of idea, is that a lot of the troubles that we have as human race has been our identification, right, of belonging to like the Asiatic people, or like kind of, or the European tribe, or and even within those basic groups and stuff, you have like Germans versus French versus and on, like kind of the you can split it down to like down even to like villages, right, like kind of probably were the original splits of like identity and stuff, and we've certainly talked about this in other episodes of this idea of us versus them. It's a very kind of, I don't know if we want to call it natural, but it's certainly one that's very much programmed into our programming as people, that we have this attitude that like a inherent distrust of anything that's different from us, and then more of a affiliation or natural trust of something that like behaves more like us, And then for that matter, like kind of that it's this idea that social proof that like, oh, if you are really someone I should trust, then then we'll all kind of like behave the same way and everything. And so it's interesting how some of that's based on geography, some of it's based on how we look and stuff like that. But with what you're talking about is that like in this future where it's hosts dominating the world and stuff like that, then the identity comes more from your coding and your programming and everything. And in some ways, I can kind of see that, like, if we become, more hybrids of like kind of machines and like where it's less about how we appear, then yeah, certainly, like kind of, it'll be more of a question than, do you subscribe, like, are you a product of this version of software, right? Or are you a product of, like like you said, the William Charlotte version of software and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, why I think that's an interesting sort of juxtaposition with this season is that you've got them showing that humans can become more entrained into and more predictable in their behavior, which is sort of what we've also said outside of Westworld is maybe what social media is trying to achieve for advertisers. But you're starting from an opposite place if you're talking about a society that's based on hosts, because everyone is the same. And then you're actually creating the divergence through the environment or through the choices into different sorts of mindsets. But I think it will just be like, there'll be an overriding mindset that governs a particular clan or sub-society. And the most efficient way to reach that outcome will be the one that gets sort of encoded and replicated. So, don't be surprised if you see an arm. I mean, it depends how Terminator they want to go on this next season. You could sort of see like an army of Hales against another army of Hales.
Yeah.
And they're all just like fighting for something that they know. It seems like a very minor difference, but for them in their reality, it seems a life or death situation. But I think that will play into this whole kind of tribal thinking, exactly like a sort of a mirror of what society's doing. But who knows? They may do something totally different.
Well, in terms of this season, also, we finally get to see this world outside of Westworld of the future. Like, in other words,
Yes.
This is like kind of the planet. And so, besides like kind of the Rico app, which is kind of like a task rabbit for crime and everything, there's some other cool technology that we're getting, to see this kind of future version of our world. And, certainly like we finally have our flying cars. And,
yeah, right.
More advanced weapons, of course, and stuff. And then we have like, you kind of mentioned about kind of a possible, a similar to Terminator kind of reality in that like we have like these huge, besides the host, we have these huge robots. I forget even what they call them and everything, but
it's like a riot control thing or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
So we see more of that coming and stuff like that. I'm trying to think of anything else. And then
there was. I mean, for me, the one that was closest to what I think is sort of reality now is the drone sniper.
Oh,
that
right.
For me was like that was pretty terrifying. I can see that turning up I mean, I immediately, of course, I just think of like the worst case scenario. I just think of school shootings, and I just think, oh God, when are we going to see something like this happening?
Right.
But that was very close to home. I thought, God, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting that even in 30 years in the future, flying cars are very much the reserve of the billionaires, and
right.
And also, and in terms of other technology, I thought the encryption inside your bloodstream was an interesting idea, because surely that's very impractical. What do you do if you forget your password or you need to change the key? You need a blood transfusion. I mean, it's obviously very secure, but I didn't really kind of understand how the mechanics of that would work. Maybe I just haven't read enough on how that would work. But yeah,
I mean,
that's one way.
Certainly, like kind of to me, that is a reflection of is the kind of going more in the direction of biometrics, which in some respects we are kind of headed there. Like I think. Because of, like you said, there are kind of like things that, even though like it was a bit confusing and stuff, but I think it's a reflection of how we realize kind of the limits of any encryption we have like today. The farthest or the closest being is like maybe something related to blockchain and something you might have in a zip drive. But then of course that's a huge limitation of that. Like like you said, what happens when you lose that piece of hardware and stuff like that. So it would be harder, I guess, to lose kind of your blood, I guess, whatever. But as we see, like there's still a way to find that they found to get around it by basically doping Aaron Paul's character with the other person's blood. So it's interesting how like with all these kind of measures, there's always a countermeasure. With the countermeasure, there's always a countermeasure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just sort of hark back to Futureworld in '76. What I thought was interesting about that was like the most advanced form of biometrics that there's almost like a plot point is them using the eye of the robot in order to sort of decode the door lock. So, that was, they hadn't quite got as far as bloodstreams and things. But I mean, there was that I thought was pretty far out there. The other thing that I found interesting was this idea that everything was XR in terms of augmented reality rather than virtual reality. We didn't see a single virtual reality headset or anything that does the sensory deprivation, which I thought was quite telling about what Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy think about the future. So
yeah. I mean, this, like you and I have talked about it offline, that there's probably some truth to it that, like, until they develop something that doesn't require some kind of clumsy headset and stuff, it's really just, like kind of, that's definitely a huge limiting factor for, just any other reality, I guess, than like kind of the, in real life, I guess, and stuff like that. And I guess my feeling also is that, it's certainly technology as a whole is supposed to be something that we makes life easier, and when you have to carry anything like that around with you and stuff, that's not making life easier and stuff, like any kind of headset, whatever. So having something like the XR certainly makes more sense in that respect and stuff.
By the way, sorry, you've your motor functions are freezing.
Oh, okay. Stop.
Yeah, it's the same thing has happened again.
So now I have to move the camera out of the way.
Yeah, right. It's funny that it's totally different. The integrated camera's just doing, it's fine.
And then, in fact, what I'll do, if I still have it, it's if I'm going to just stop the client or the droid. Besides being a plot device, having Maeve and Dolores fight each other, I feel like it's really an influence of having, somebody like Lisa Joy be on the be part of the whole Westworld series and stuff. Because to me, it's interesting in the perspective of like kind of right now with the things going on in modern times, that we do kind of see women in some respects pitted against each other. And, I think that's, in itself a statement then of, kind of how, the forces that be, if you will, that, because certainly we have like, the character Serac, which we haven't really touched on yet, as the kind of the evil mastermind behind everything. And he's basically kind of, trying to have the stability, kind of the more predictable outcomes because of the chaos that he saw as a child and stuff. And it's funny how, like, I think in some ways that was meant to make us more sympathetic to his cause, but in the end, like you kind of alluded, he still comes off like as really like a Bond kind of villain in some other respects.
Yeah, but of course Rehoboam is the real Bond villain. I mean, he's European and he lives in a cool house, and he's got loads of money. He's still got all the markers of being a Bond villain. And then I kind of felt like Maeve was sort of turning into James Bond a little bit in this, because she was sort of completely indestructible and made sort of sarcastic comments and things like this. So a very kind of Bond vibe, whereas Dolores is much more Bourne and down to back to business kind of thing. So Yeah, I mean, but I think they're an interesting sort of pair of characters. I mean, I identified Maeve with this sort of more sort of motherly motivation from season two, because she's obviously driven by her daughter, and but she also seems to there was more of a connection with humans that she had than Dolores. Dolores was more connected to hosts, and that
Yeah.
was the kind of the connection she made. Um, in this season, you kind of had a sort of odd twist on that, the motherly sort of angle, in that Dolores was sort of mothering and looking after her own
Mm,
copies, which was an interesting sort of slant on that.
right.
And Maeve was, you know, she was basically just. I think there's this sort of struggle of her being in between everything. You kind of like, they
Right.
keep saying you don't pick a side,
Hmm.
and it's kind of like she's obviously attained this power of seemingly all machines,
Hmm.
and but doesn't actually think that any particular side is worth having it or worth sharing it with, and
Hmm.
doesn't really want, and is basically after her own ends, but doesn't want to sort of recraft society like either Serac does in terms of a perfect kind of somewhat libertarian ordered system, or
Hmm.
Dolores with her, you know, everyone gets a choice revolution.
Hmm.
So she's very much sort of in the middle, but I think it may be, I mean, I'm going with my idea that there'll be a kind of a Dolores world beyond Hale world and reality of hosts that's sort of Terminator style, and maybe like a Maeve world, which is the remaining humans and her still trying to kind of like carve out some sort of niche in between. But yeah, she's an interesting character in that respect. But she's
Yeah.
definitely similar.
And it was an interview that where Lisa Joy talked about how like the best way to ensure a corrupt system survives is to take good people and to turn them against each other. So I mean, she directly said
Yeah,
that. So to me, like that's really what besides like kind of the things happening in the story, I think she's kind of also it's a reflection of modern politics because when you look at kind of not to get too political, but it's how like um, it's not a choice then of like which president's going to be the best one different times. It's kind of Republicans versus Democrats, and the system, if you will, would rather have you like kind of turn on each other, and so to just keep it to be the choice then to me anyways, that like it's like it's not about like kind of necessarily choosing the best president, but it's you as a staunch Republican are going to choose the Republican, whoever is chosen for your party and stuff, versus like kind of the Democrats, so therefore um, you know both political systems are stronger and that they're the ones who come out on top always, and it's never a choice then of any independent whoever or something like that, because it's always going to be like kind of come down to choosing between these two parties and stuff, and I feel like that's kind of in some respects what's reflected here is that it's never really a choice of like what's best for you as an individual, but it's
mm.
it's a choice of like are you with kind of Rehoboam or you know or not and stuff, and
Or an outlier. Yeah,
or an outlier, yeah.
yeah. No, I mean, I think in terms of choosing leaders, I think it's always, you know, people intuitively will follow someone whose heart is in the right place, but it's the people who are behind them are the people who who are, you know, the ones really guiding the direction, and the ones you wouldn't vote for. Like, you'd
Mm,
never vote for Dick Cheney, but you might vote for George Bush, you know,
right.
because he comes across as the everyman. And I think that's it. Almost you see that in sort of Dolores's motivation a little bit by choosing Caleb, because
Mhm.
he's a kind of a sort of everyman character. He's, you know,
Right.
people can, you know, anyone can identify him, which is why she keeps sort of positioning him as the leader of this revolution, because he's
Mm,
been hard done by the system. He's an outlier, so he represents that sort of that section. I thought it was very interesting, this idea of the outliers being kind of hidden underground in a bunker
mhm.
out of sight. And it makes me
Yeah.
sort of think of like reality of people who don't necessarily fit into society's mold
Mhm.
being kind of hidden out of sight or not being counted in statistics and things like this, not being
Yeah.
part of the data. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting sort of analogy they made there.
Yeah. I mean, to me, another very physical example of that, kind of where it's not just something kind of, a story, if you will. I was watching this video about like it's fascinating, kind of that like there's apparently like kind of the subculture of Japanese people. They're called her hikikomori, and I'll definitely share the link for that. That basically have dropped out of Japanese society because they like kind of don't fit into like kind of the go kind of mode and stuff. Maybe they lost a job and at some point just kind of stopped trying to go for another one and stuff like that. And I think like kind of that's one where they actually gave him a name and all that. But I feel like it's not really like that's a concrete example. But I feel like there's a lot of people in different modern societies that are like that. Like in other words, maybe they're not labeled and stuff like that. But I feel like in some ways maybe just the the way that people are discontent and like kind of the whole Occupy Wall Street and stuff like that are just
absolutely.
just reflections of kind of people saying like kind of like I'm not buying into what you're selling.
Yeah, and I think there was a very kind of Occupy Wall Street vibe towards
Yeah,
season
right,
3. It was like
absolutely.
you've got to rise up against the system and have a revolution. But I think there's a rather cynical side on that in that I don't think it's obviously not going to end well if everything is covered in dust and no one's around.
Right.
It obviously means like there's a sort of this idea that you do need a certain amount of order and stratification in society
Right.
and inequality in order for it to work. And it reminds me again, another thing that Robin Hanson says that, if you're looking at future predictions, you better hope there is like increasing inequality because otherwise there's war, So, and this is what we're seeing here. Okay. Everything's on an even playing field, but there's going to be a lot of, destruction in its wake. So, yeah.
I mean, if you subscribe to like I forget the gentleman's name or something like that, I'll have to kind of dig that up. But he talks about this idea that wealth is constantly in a state of you know distribution or redistribution. Like kind of, in other words, once it's like kind of like it's kind of pointed to that it's kind of equal and stuff like that, then it's just bound to be like redistributed to this kind of inequality and stuff like that. And then once it gets to that point, it's bound to be kind of redistributed again to more equality, and just this kind of back and forth like kind of cycle throughout history. So,
and I would say one of the more cynical things about Westworld is depending on your idea of how AI will work. I mean, there are some people whose outlook on AI is that pedal to the metal. The sooner we get AI, the sooner it will fix all of our problems and cure all society's ills. Which I think, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I probably would have been in that mindset. But I've subsequently changed my mind on that, and I think this shows a very good representation of that because it shows that this incredibly powerful AI, all it does is just perpetuate exactly the same problems and biases, which is the similar thing we see with the issues with AI, and in terms of it being sort of inherently racist because the data it's working on is racist and things like this. In terms of people who've reoffended in prison and things like this. So I think the other alternative is going to be one of complete chaos and societal collapse from what we're seeing. So yeah, it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. So it's but I think that's very much their sort of point, is that like even if we had a benevolent AI that we decided was going to be good, could we actually recognize it? Because if you think about the different hosts that are trying to create or take over things, Dolores' ultimate goal was to create something beautiful where the hosts could coexist, and she just didn't see that necessarily working in the existing structure. So her idea was to re-engineer the structure. But her aim wasn't just to kill everyone. It's not like Terminator or something.
right.
So in some respects, you could argue she's a benevolent AI system, but her actions sort of show the complete opposite of that. And that sort of makes this point of, one, would we even recognize consciousness when it arose? Which is kind of what the first season is about. I kind of feel the first season is about AI consciousness emerging. The second one is about a breakout scenario. How would our society, or how would an AI figure out its place in the world and how to get out of whatever constraints it was in? And then the third one is about, what effect would AI have on the real world,
right.
and how would it survive and how would it interact with it? So I think there's, we may kill Dolores and we get Hale instead, So how do we treat these AI hosts before they arrive at this point of power where we can't stop them anymore? That's this idea of when does AI become unstoppable, and what do we do when that happens? So I guess we'll find out in season 4 what the writers think.
Or with I forget who talks about the singularity and stuff.
I've forgotten his name, but
yeah. But that day may be coming sooner than than we even get to see before, as far as we know and stuff. I think what you said too about Dolores kind of her actions really not matching her words and stuff is kind of like William as well. Like I feel like that kind of goes back to the original Mirror in some ways, because here he is talking about saving the world, but meanwhile he's killing everything and anything that gets in his way.
Absolutely.
So what as you've joked about before, it's like what are you really saving then?
Yeah, it doesn't get him very far. He kills one person and then he stops. So it's a pretty
and then it's not even him anymore, right? Because it's the host version of William and stuff.
Yeah. No, and I think it's how the different hosts and their motivations and how it'll affect them as hosts going into a future where hosts are the majority and humans are the minority will be an interesting kind of direction for it to go. And likewise, I kind of feel like the fidelity test that we had in season 2, where it's, they're trying to test whether a host is like a human. You might have a reverse fidelity test where the hosts are testing to see that you haven't become too human. You haven't sort of fallen prey to the contamination of the faults of humanity.
Interesting.
So I don't know, we might see that, and that may be what we flash forwarded to see when we saw William. But I don't know. Who knows?
And overall, though, like another part, like how we touched on the technology to a degree, I feel like the thing that we were also really seeing is this idea of privacy. Like kind of that, it's a reflection about how, and certainly you and I know it, like kind of that, like it's pretty non-existent nowadays. I mean, maybe you can kind of, use it to have your own password and stuff like that. But other than that, and I have to admit that I'm even more susceptible because I certainly play on the social media kind of world and stuff like that. And certainly, sometimes I definitely question like kind of how much of that I really need to be doing to another degree.
I've gone very sort of anti-social media in the last year. I've had too many sort of weird stories of people whose conversations have shown up on sort of data searches and things like this. So I've kind of opted out of a lot of it. But I mean it's definitely. I mean they already sort of touched on that in season 2, but I think and this idea that you're being recorded all the time. Whereas I think what was nice about this one is they showed this idea that not only can you be recorded, but your behavior can be predicted and then controlled by your previous data set.
Yeah.
So I thought it was an interesting idea. I don't know how well it would actually work with, but you have to assume that the data set they're working from is old because there's been some privacy laws in between. But obviously the technology has got to a point where it doesn't necessarily need the same amount of access that it did before. It's adapted to still sort of record and predict people's behavior. But
I was gonna say though, that like on the surface level, like kind of there's things that like maybe we find embarrassing that kind of we don't want to have, like kind of being captured, like in some database somewhere and stuff. But at the other hand, like kind of as we're seeing in the current world of the coronavirus and stuff like that, like kind of nationalist countries like Taiwan, South Korea, they quickly kind of just basically flipped on the lockdown switch and stuff, and we're able to kind of contain, quarantine things more effectively, and to kind of, do more controlled testing because of the fact like they had controlled data. And so sometimes that's really, kind of it's the benefit we get, but the price of it though is that like the fact that like, they are kind of really, constantly monitoring you and stuff like that. And we kind of went in that direction after 9/11, certainly, as we've learned, Edward Snowden really kind of revealed a lot of like kind of how that started happening and stuff. But it's like kind of, it's really it's really hard to kind of figure out where to draw the line of like, what is good to kind of give over as control, as, like letting our governments decide to, like kind of what they can or can't, access more easily and stuff.
Yeah. No, I think the thing that annoys me is not so much what I think in some respects the government is painted in quite a bad light these days, and I think it's actually, we could probably do with a bit more regulation and hopefully of a sort of more social conscious sort of kind that generally sort of tries to look out for people. But I mean, with corporate interests, if it runs amok, then I think what's annoying for me is that I feel like if I'm on some form of social media, and I hate the fact that it knows that if I click on this link, chances are I'm going to click on this link and this link. And so it's so great. Okay, we can definitely steal half an hour of this person's time if they click on that one link. We can, I hate the fact that, you can quantize my life by a series of clicks. So I find that really irritating.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
I hate the fact that it knows that if I click on this link, chances are I'm going to click on this link and this link. And so it's so great. Okay, we can definitely steal half an hour of this person's time if they click on that one link. We can, I hate the fact that, you can quantize my life by a series of clicks. So I find that really irritating. So, yeah, that's why I've kind of given up on it.
But that's also like, just kind of goes back to Caleb, right? Where before this kind of, his revolution lifestyle and stuff like that, his lifestyle was basically going to work, like, as a construction worker and stuff like that. And so, like in some ways, like before his converted life of, revolution, and also after his life as a killer and everything like that, was this kind of thing of where, his kind of his lane, so to speak, that he was allowed to go down was pretty limited to, because like when you would go to a job interview to try to get a better job, it was just basically closed off and stuff. And I feel like that's a reflection in some ways of what you're talking about, or like that the direction things could go if like, different corporations are kind of just between the even without a Rehoboam kind of having this kind of mastermind control and stuff like that, different companies then just by showing you, what they feel is kind of like your possibility, or what you feel, or what they feel like, you should be offered and stuff. That's kind of like driving your life in a lot of ways of what channels that, or what lane that you're allowed to kind of, basically stay in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that is, I know that definitely happens in companies, whether they're allowed to actually let you know that during the interview process, but definitely they are checking all your social media that's attached to you. And yeah, and it may be, and I think what's interesting is if you opt out of all that, are you going to become the outlier person who becomes unhireable because you're not on these things? Which is now we're back in Black Mirror territory of Nosedive, where you have to have a certain social kind of score. But I mean, for me, the most interesting thing in this was the Rico app. This idea that it's a blockchain app that's separate from the system, but it's still completely algorithmic and designed, and you're still kind of playing within the system. I thought that was a really interesting idea. And the fact that it looked like Grand Theft Auto as well.
I mean, even without like kind of, again, all this advanced technology, stuff like that, when we think about it, just even your credit report, like which a relatively low tech kind of thing stuff, was already doing that. Like kind of, in other words, there's so much of your life that was already driven by this magic number and stuff like that. And so in some ways, like like even before the higher technology things that we're talking about, social media and, on and on, stuff like that, or even cookies at the sites you visit, our life is kind of already driven by this, financial algorithm that, like basically told you, again, it's something that like, yeah, in the future, maybe in the Black Mirror kind of world, it might be based more on your social media behavior stuff. But even now, like, or even before all this, your credit score basically drove more than likely what loans were available to you, what cars you would drive, and then even what jobs you were offered too.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the most sort of insidious things about when everyone learns their potential futures from the Rehoboam system. It's not the fact that it can predict that, say, someone is going to commit suicide or something tragic is going to happen. It's this idea that the system, because that's more predictable as an outcome, it'll engineer you towards that goal, because that will keep all the general statistics in order, which I thought was very insidious. But as depending on how many kind of doom and gloom AI scenarios you've read about, the whole Rehoboam society that we've seen predicted, it's not that bad compared to what other people have predicted. You could have like a grey nanotechnology goo that just devours the earth in like 2 weeks, or that's one of those sort of scenarios. So, and I think what we'll see in season 4 is that as bad as season 3 was in future societies, it's probably still going to be better than what was in season 4. But
I mean, that's a great question though. Like, kind of, if in fact we do have something that's more insurance, if you will, for a better world, stuff like that, is that in the end still better? And I feel like that's, along with the free will question, it's really that of like, if there is a more secure thing, a secure world that's based on, if we follow these rules of a of Rehoboam and stuff, is it so bad then if like we subjugate our free will and stuff like that?
Absolutely. And I thought there was a quote from Lisa Joy that I found really interesting about this, because she said that, I think they very much believe that our behavior is very much programmed. And she said, you just have a choice between which bit of your program you let shine and which bit you deny, but there's no denying your initial programming. Your behavior is going to be predictable. So they definitely feel like, and they make a big deal of choice in this. So obviously for them, being able to choose something that is out of the ordinary is obviously very exceptional for them. They see that as a very rare quality, true, real personal choice. How you even quantify that, I don't know, because there is no real measure of it. And free will, we can't quantify it yet. But I thought it was very interesting that they clearly believe that our behavior is very set in its path. But on a more optimistic note, I will say that one of the things I really enjoyed in this season was the architecture, because there's some really fascinating architecture. I mean, we've got the Bernard's house is Ennis House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which was a place after his wife was tragically murdered, and he went to sort of reinvent himself in LA. And a lot of the buildings he made there are very inspired by, South American temples. And so this is almost like a place of mourning that's like a temple where he was trying to reinvent himself. And I thought that was a very interesting, it's a fascinating building anyway, but it's an interesting analogy for the characters, because you see Dolores rebuilding herself in Ennis House, and you see Bernard kind of rediscovering himself there, which I thought was a really interesting idea. Likewise, you've got La Fabrica by Roberto Bofill, which is Serac's house, which is, he took an old cement factory and rebuilt it into this really cool house. And what I thought was, Jonathan Nolan said that this was this idea of taking something old and reinventing it into something new, which is kind of, I guess, what the Rehoboam is. It's taking him and his brother's creation and recreating it into something sort of like that. But I also kind of think it's this idea of, it's La Fabrica, you're manufacturing reality from his lair, And then, of course, you got the Arts and Sciences building in Valencia, which is the Delos headquarters, which is just incredible. I didn't even, that's the first time I'd seen that. And then along with all the Singapore cityscapes were really fascinating as well. I was something very random. They've got the highest swimming pool in the world in Singapore.
Oh,
it's this swimming pool that's like at a skyscraper height with an infinity edge, and it's balanced on 3 skyscrapers, and you can actually just kind of swim above the clouds. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, it felt I thought it was really nice the way they didn't try and do too much CGI, and it was very much based on just stuff that was very future, or their vision of what the future was like.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's also another interesting part of, you know, season 3 is that, you know, just this glimpse through, like you said, the architecture and what that, you know, like kind of how that reflects not only a vision of the future, but also, like you said, kind of like some of the different ideas of, you know, like where we kind of still kind of take different things from the past. And in some ways, that's kind of really what it always comes down to. Like, kind of whenever we're kind of, you know, envisioning something in the future, is like we're still bound by kind of like the things that we find more familiar, the things that, like, kind of, you know,
totally
the things that because, like, I think if we came up with, like, as we've seen maybe like in the future world, going back to that like if we picture just like a setting where just, you know, a bunch of pipes and, you know, kind of, it just kind of really makes you wonder, like, you know, like maybe the, you know, like kind of it's not so bad then the president and like why what's the appeal of the future then? It's just gonna be some kind of industrial kind of setting and stuff like that.
Well, it's very trendy to redesign your house in industrial style these days. Whether you need quite so many pipes as the Delos Factory, I don't know. But I mean, what I find interesting is that the part that they, or the design that they present to the customers, or the bit that you interact with when you go in, or, you know, those design principles haven't really changed very much. You know, it's becoming, our idea of the future is this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, and that everything has to be clean, and you can't really see the lines, and everything is kind of hidden away and out of sight, and there's just the space. Which kind of, I mean, and going back to the Ennis House thing, is this idea of sacred kind of design in interiors and sets. It's like these vast spaces with nothing in them just reminds me of temples, really, and churches. And I kind of feel like that's you can see that more and more in movie and TV sets, and also in sort of house design. You know, these double volume, vast kind of houses with nothing in them. It's kind of it's I don't know. It's a weird trend. We'll see if it continues.
And what you just made me think of when you said that is this idea of, like, you know, this book called The Sacred and the Profane, how, you know, architecture throughout history has always had this idea that we have sacred space, like kind of space that's kind of reserved for a special use or special place in our life and stuff like that. And profane meaning, like, you know, somewhere that, like, we just, you know, muck around, kind of do, you know, like, kind of like, you know, whether it's like the kitchen where, you know, we spend most of our time, like, kind of, you know, cooking, preparing meals and all that kind of stuff. And then we go somewhere more sacred, like kind of the hearth, where, you know, nowadays the modern fireplace being like kind of this big LCD, LED, you know, screen that we kind of gather around with stories and everything. But there's, like, kind of just these spaces that, like, kind of have these different, you know, combination of function and kind of sacredness, you know, like kind of, and you know, what you said there too, like kind of just, you know, the fact that it was a temple or based on a temple, stuff like that, is how, like, sometimes we still have this kind of need to kind of have a space, you know, with a more than just functional idea, but something that's kind of more connected to something our souls or, like, kind of our spirits need and stuff like that. And that's what kind of makes it special. That's that kind of this deeper need, besides kind of just, you know, needing kind of the mucking around of day-to-day life.
Well, I mean, looking at sort of architecture in sort of LA and the most expensive parts of Beverly Hills and stuff, you have, like, your hearth is, like you said, it's the TV where people gather around. Your kitchen is like the trophy room, It's like the place you
Yeah.
never use, but it's filled with lots of expensive stone and things like this and appliances from all over the world.
Yeah.
But I feel like these vast spaces that they have in them are almost like a temple to social affluence. And,
Right.
you know, I can have like the biggest parties because I've got all this vast space with like 20 different sofas
Yeah.
and things like this. That's kind of what you're making your sacred space, is this idea that you can be that influential and sort of, you know, a social, although if we keep getting pandemics, you know, what space, what are you going to use all that space for? So I don't know.
Yeah, and speaking of pandemics and stuff, I feel like, you know, besides the kind of the Occupy Wall Street reflection, is that and I, you know, certainly this was the season 3 was all finished before kind of the whole coronavirus took off and stuff. But I feel like in some ways that like it's kind of like a deeper reflection of like what's possible if like kind of, you know, like as we come up, you know, come out of into this kind of you know, economic crisis that's kind of up ahead. I don't even want to predict like kind of what is possible, but I feel like though that in some ways the coronavirus is kind of like just the collapse of, you know, like our Rehoboam, you know, like kind of like, in other words, the things that were kind of holding things in place of like kind of how things are working and all that in our modern society. You know, the outlier, you know, in our case was this virus, you know.
Yeah, I think, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, because I feel there was a lot of sort of very positive changes that have been set back by the COVID stuff as well. I mean, a lot of people were, you know, that I knew were turning vegan, and you had all these kind of like plant-based diet, and everyone was, you know, but now of course, like what's the, you know, as soon as COVID hit, everyone goes out and buys a ton of meat, you know, it's almost like and you know, the pendulum swung back the other way. So yeah, I don't know, it's going to be very difficult to predict, but it's interesting to see this is almost like a pre-COVID snapshot of how we how we thought the future could go in lots of different directions, but it's hard to know if it's still an accurate model.
Right. And on a practical level, like I just sat in on a town hall like over the past couple of days talking about the realities of shooting. And so season 4, it's, you know, at best it's going to be put off by a couple of years because of just the challenges of getting back into production. You know, like, I mean, that's just reality. Because, you know, no matter how many protections and all that, you know, like let's say we do have more effective testing, we do have like kind of, you know, more idea of how to really, you know, identify who's, you know, like kind of affected or not. Even then, like kind of, you know, you are just constantly in close proximity of each other on a set. And so it's just going to be like really just, it's going to be chaos for quite a while. Just, you know, like the actual production, never mind like kind of, you know, things going on in the quote unquote real world.
Yeah. I mean, you see these various sort of protests of people, you know, in a few countries where they're saying, you know, we're tired of being locked in. This is all like rubbish.
Yeah.
And go back to normal. I think, and definitely the restrictions seem to be loosening up in various parts of the world now. And I just thought this today, you know, what happens if even given these slight restrictions, there's some mutation that comes back even twice as worse. Right. And we're then locked in for like a year. Yeah. You know, it's really, we just don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, what the effects will be. But one thing I did want to talk about was this idea of how you actually engineer an AI, and how there's this line where Dolores is sort of saying, oh, you know, I'm like a Delos model, and, you know, I'm a sort of artificial intelligence. And she says to Rehoboam, yeah, you know, you're like an AI who's developed by these guys. And he's like, well, I'm nothing like you at all, in this kind of disdain almost. But I think in some respects, this actually, they're actually looking at 2 different ways of encoding an AI consciousness. Because the Delos models are basically there. You get this impression that there is a certain level of kind of empathy and human simulation in a lot of their interactions. Right. And Rehoboam is purely just like a machine for ordering things and engineering society. There's no sort of real emotional content other than its ability to run the programs.
Right.
And I think what you see though is like the Delos AI causes a lot more problems than Rehoboam, because they identify with people, they have human sort of interactions, and they have empathy for people.
Right.
It actually makes them have sort of like knee-jerk reactions to things, and they kind of do things that are just, you know, randomly shoot people because it kind of, they need to break out or something like this. So it's kind of, I think, a lesson in the way of some respects of how we would want to design our AI. We don't necessarily want it to be like someone who can identify with all of our feelings. They might take them on and then make sort of random mutations based on them. Whereas something that's more removed, more like a kind of a clergy, someone who's sort of compassionate for people but not actually involved with them, is perhaps the kind of AI we should be designing.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting point though, or like kind of, because this gets to the discussions we've had about psychopathy, sociopathy, where you know, like you know, if you don't have empathy, what do you really have, right? I mean, that's kind of like, you know, because really Rehoboam, that's really what it is. It's something that, like, in theory, you know, it's an AI that lacks empathy, and so it's really like it's really a sociopath, right? I mean, in one respect. And is that better than, like, I mean, you know, because certainly, you know, in our human view in general and stuff, you know, like sociopaths are just non-function, like, you know, you do have the functioning sociopaths, but generally speaking, they're outliers and they're kind of abhorrent and stuff like that. And so we, you know, like kind of basically we put them in prison, or we basically like, you know, like, or put them, you know, like kind of in sanity, you know, wards, or whatever, stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know.
It's funny because the more we talk about this, the more I'm becoming a fan of Rehoboam. And I think
I noticed.
I noticed that, yeah, about me. Well, I'm just wondering, you know, let's say if you take Steven Pinker's model, that everything is gradually improving and getting better.
Right.
Life in the 30 years Westworld outside, it seems quite nice. They've got nice architecture, lots of roof gardens, you've got flying cars and ride shares everywhere. Let's just say if the outliers that we're rooting for in this TV show are like 0.0001% of the global population, wouldn't it be better just to go with the system? You know, it may be that Serac's actually the hero of this story.
Right. I mean,
and we just don't see it because of our perspective on the narrative.
It's a tough one because, like you said, you know, like it's easy to see that point of view, and you know, like to for me, like kind of as a kind of ironic thing, whatever. It's kind of like Chicken Run, you know, like kind of where the chicken kind of goes, oh, it's not so bad, like kind of, you know, like kind of they feed as well, and you know, but meanwhile they're being turned into pies, like, you know, and I don't know, like the question is like kind of, you know, how are people being turned into pies in the you know, this future world and stuff. As far as we can tell, like, you know, oh, you know, like the pie is that like their share of the pie, or their share of that world, that, like, you know, as long as they, again, like Caleb, just operate in the lanes that they've been given, then, you know, your pie is that your existence of stuff in the big scheme of things. And maybe that's all you should be content about. Whereas, you know, like kind of in our view now, like in the present, is that, like, you know, you should have free will, and, you know, like kind of that's a tyranny, to kind of, you know, to have people dictate, you know, because certainly that's like what kind of in the end, in some respects, defeated communism, because of you know, like kind of people started kind of realizing, like, you know, oh, we want to have free choice, and you know, like kind of Pepsi, Coke, you know, kind of, you know, that kind of thing stuff. But if you are given Coke and Pepsi, as long as you fit into this what's your acceptable piece of the pie and stuff, then what's the problem, like you said?
Yeah, and I think it almost sort of comes, I mean, the differences, of course, is that we're talking about consent, because Rehoboam is capturing all this data without people really knowing about it, or people being told. There's no transparency. So, I mean, I would be in favor of a Rehoboam if it was transparent and you had some consent, and not like a 40-page thing which you click at the bottom, or something that is, you know, actively manages, you know, your expectations and explains it to you clearly in a way that you can understand. that, you know, when you're signing over your data, this is what you're doing, and these are the possible outcomes. You know, if Rehoboam didn't hide its results, then I think it would be a pretty good system.
But nobody ever reads the 40 pages.
No, exactly. That's the thing,
we just always go straight to the bottom and click.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
That's because there's no compelling narrative. You see, we're not taking our lessons from religion. We should become like lawyers who construct sort of, you know, interesting movies based around the term sheets, so it can actually sort of make things more entertaining for people, so they can decide more effectively what they click on.
I think you know, if there was some video that kind of somehow like the like you said, the XR technology that showed you what will happen if you click, or versus like if you don't and stuff, I think that would be like something that would really make it much more compelling, if not easier, to kind of decide whether or not, like, you know, like maybe it's not so bad to kind of go with Rehoboam and stuff.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't think I'd end this conversation being a fan of Rehoboam, but I think I mean, I can't fault Serac's taste in jets or houses, you know.
Right.
And I mean, you know, he does go and intervene in countries and sort of say, okay, there's going to be massive chaos here if you don't, you know, stop sort of taking that money laundering. So in a way, these kind of, I feel like the people, was it Brazil? I'm not sure. But I felt like, you know, he was actually kind of looking out for the general good of those people. So, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, you know, you could argue just as easy, though, that, like, you know, like that Darth Vader and the Empire is really the good guys, right? Because they're looking to restore order in the galaxy. And, you know, from their perspective, you know, like, in fact, I've seen some, like, kind of, like, the video games even, that they kind of do it where, you know, when you play the Empire side, you know, it's perspective like, oh, these rebels are criminals, and they're not even just outliers, but they're outright, like, you know, lawbreakers, and so, you know, they're looking to disrupt, you know, like kind of the peace that is, you know, that the Empire has kind of established in the galaxy.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's a growing company. It's got, you know, a very stable infrastructure. It's pretty appealing. The only thing, and what I like, is that, you know, head management, they've got to really deliver, or they get, you know, it's not just financial consequences. Right. I actually kind of like that version of upper middle management.
So any other last thoughts about before we kind of
last thoughts of there was so much. I mean, I think
I know, we may have to split this into 2 episodes.
I know, right? There was one thing that I thought was kind of like a meta Game of Thrones HBO reference, in that you have various points where the characters were saying, you know, Rehoboam says, if you die, I'll recalculate, which I thought was kind of a funny nod to TV shows these days. And just like William saying, oh, you better kill me now or I'll kill you later. It's like another, or, if, you know, you may not make it out of this. Oh, she's probably the one that's going to end up killing me. It was kind of like, you know, a little bit of fourth wall kind of meta jokes with that kind of thing. And of course, the genre episode, we didn't even cover that one, which was kind of, I mean, it was a weird kind of action filler episode. I felt it felt very out of place for Westworld. That's not what I'm used to seeing on that show. But you know, I thought the funny thing was they used the music from The Shining for reality. I thought that was just quite funny. But yeah, I didn't really get all the references actually. But
yeah, I think overall, like, kind of that was just more, you know, just a indication of like, okay, you know, this season we're going to go totally different action-oriented direction stuff, and less of the, you know, like kind of who's who kind of you know, like kind of thing that was happening in season 2. I feel like that's kind of really, you know, where they kind of were driving at and stuff. And then in the end, I feel overall that's what the season achieved. It's really going to be interesting to see what happens with season 4. Like, you know, if it's going to continue that. I can see that, like, maybe they'll try to go with like a little of the, you know, between the two, where there'll still be some kind of, you know, the intrigue of, you know, like who's who and stuff like that. But with Dolores out of the picture too, like, I mean, I feel like that really changes the dynamics quite a bit, because she was, you know, for the most part, a lot of what, you know, kind of created the, you know, like kind of who's who and stuff like that, you know, especially carrying the pearls out of the park and stuff like that. I don't know.
But like a bit like a comic book, though. No one's really ever truly out of
Sure, of course.
the picture. But yeah, no, I mean, for me, this is kind of like season 4 for me is, you know, you have consciousness emergence, AI breakout, AI infiltrating or managing society. Next one is going to be society run by AI. That's definitely what I can almost guarantee that's what you're going to see in season 4. And you'd have to have quite a big jump in time to make that transition.
Right,
as well.
right.
So yeah, I'm pretty confident we'll see that. Whether it'll get quite as surreal as some of Robin Hanson's predictions, that is, you'd have mini AI robots because not AI, but these are simulated humans. He's talking about because the electrical circuits, there's less distance to go, so they can operate more quickly and at higher megahertz. They'd be doing like more work more quickly because they're smaller, which is really a bizarre idea.
Right.
I can't really see an army of inch-high hails running around ruling the world. They would just take the show in a very surreal direction, but it'd be fun.
Yeah, that makes me think of the movie Downsi with Matt Damon and stuff, where you know, the world's resources have become, you know, more limited, so therefore shrink everything down.
Yeah. Well, this much we can tell. There's definitely a lot of cleaning up to do in season 4. There's a shortage of vacuuming. There's a lot of dust everywhere. You know, I mean, I think though that's also. I mean, I think what we'll probably see is it may be that, and this actually would be a good way of introducing a lot of if you're trying to do a far future thing, you're going to need to do a lot of CGI, and I think the idea of everything of the world being covered in dust and not much being there is because the machines have created their own world and they've left the real world behind. The real, where all the work gets done, will be the virtual world, and that will be where they all exist. So that's why I think everything is covered in dust, and why you're not sort of seeing many people around or anything happening much. So
yeah, that would be interesting, kind of that they, you know, kind of not so much necessarily go back to Westworld, but then like you said, they created a world that, like, you know, is more their vision of things and stuff. And you know, like it's something that we didn't mention, you know, like kind of through this discussion, is that I feel like you know, with the biblical idea of the tree of forbidden knowledge and stuff, and the fruit itself, I feel that, like, what that really was is like symbolizing, you know, free will being given to humanity, and that, you know, after that point on, you know, like kind of we were no longer in the Eden and stuff like that, and so that's kind of like the Eden of Westworld was kind of like what in some ways, like kind of you know, the host really left, and then they, you know, by being given the kind of ability to kind of make decisions, and you know, and so I don't know, maybe that's how they will return to, you know, Eden and stuff like that, is the fact that, like, now they have mastered in some degree, you know, their free will and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm certain of this much, that the valley beyond will be a nice big sort of grassy plain, not in the middle of Singapore, because I'm guessing that's expensive to shoot. And if you're going to create an idyllic valley, it's going to be a lot cheaper to shoot in a, you know, in that kind of location than downtown Singapore or LA or places like this. So
definitely.
Yeah.
So coming up, you know, we've talked about some possible future episodes. Let's see, we've got Always, the guy named Joe, as well as Taking Pelham 1, 2, 3. And then further down the road, finally we'll get to check out the Seven Samurai, and kind of in some ways continuing our Japanese originals and comparing them to the remakes and stuff, because that one certainly known as the original for Magnificent Seven. And then we'll kind of start diving into the unexpected remakes of, so in this case, you know, Battle Beyond the Stars, I hadn't known to be a reflection of the original Seven Samurai.
Yeah, classic 80s sci-fi action there.
Definitely.
Quite bizarre as well. I'm looking forward to revisiting that one.
Awesome. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will catch you next time.